is that at the same time, people in the CFO, chief financial officers, chief information officers, all of them are going through their own sort of paradigm shift or metamorphosis, where you're now looking at the enterprise as a holistic view where you're no longer locked into individual functional silos. So when we talked about the changing face of procurement in 2005, in 2011, it's actually the changed face of procurement. And what we're going to focus on today is touching on some of the highlights, including what's happening with chief financial officers, what's happening with chief information officers, and what that means to you in terms of how you have to adjust or adapt to the evolving reality. So let's go to the next slide if we could, because one of the things that's kind of interesting is if you look at it, I talk about the removal of functional silos or traditional boundaries, and you know those are really starting to happen. In the past, again, buying was seen as more or less a function of saying, go out there, get the best price at the best cost. There wasn't a whole lot of strategic thinking in relation to that. Well, of course, that's began to change, and over a few years, the last couple of years, I've seen finance people, for example, more and more of them migrate over into purchasing. I've seen chief information officers and initiatives dealing with technology where purchasing is now getting involved on the front end rather than the back end. And it was kind of ironic to me, just to digress, in that so many of these technological strategies and implementations which were designed to help purchasing, the very last people who were ever consulted were the purchasing people. Well, now that's starting to change. And so in essence, what's happening is traditional boundaries are beginning to reshape, and you have those silos coming down. And in fact, going to the next slide if we could, the reality is that many of the functional requirements of again, chief information officers have changed. There was a survey in one of the associations where they now said that we have to redefine. We're no longer going to be called chief information officers. We have to get out there. We can't lock ourselves in a technological bubble and worry about just making it work in the background. We have to actually get out there and understand how the business operates, how it functions, what we need to do in that regard. And the same with financial officers and people in finance. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at it, what does this mean to purchasing people? The rules have changed. It's a whole new game. What do you have to do to not be left out in the cold? Because, and I want to digress, the CPO Agenda did a roundtable not that long ago, and they had senior executives coming together from companies such as Danone, Nestle's, large organizations, and the ironic statement out of that is, as they recognize the strategic importance of purchasing, what they said is that the best people to run a purchasing department are not individuals who have a purchasing background. I mean, just think about that for a moment. They don't have a purchasing background. They're looking at financial people coming in and taking the helm of the purchasing department. That is kind of a shocking statement, and when I first heard that, it stopped me in my tracks. Why is that? What are some of the reasons? Now, if I was there in person, I'd be asking you for your feedback, but obviously I don't want to get rich running around with a microphone. But something that stood out to me, that still does, and in fact I wrote a series just this past week in the Procurement Insights blog called Bridging the Disconnect Between Finance and Purchasing. And let me just read a quote to you, because it was originally appeared in an article, Harvard Business Review. And this is what it said. Many purchasing managers' skills and outlooks were formed 20 years ago in an era of relative stability. They haven't changed. And that's really something that you have to ask yourself. Has the world around you is changing? Has the marketplace is changing? Has the requirements and the functional requirements within an enterprise is changing? Have you kept up with it? Is the curriculums through the various associations, are they helping you to keep up with what those changes are? Do you know what those changes are? That's the real issue. And so when you look at something like this, you have to wonder, where are we going to fit in? What do we have to do in terms of our knowledge? Now, again, I alluded to the series, the Bridging the Disconnect Between Finance and Purchasing. One of the interesting things, and I'll touch on those statistics momentarily, is that by and large, finance does not feel that purchasing makes any tangible contribution to competitiveness of the entire organization. I mean, that's kind of a unnerving, if you will, type of a statement. Now, to go to the next slide, and again, I touched on this, This is what the executives thought in that CPO roundtable, and this is a direct quote. One strategic business thinker with the right skills and capabilities is worth 10 to 12 of your normal run-of-the-mill purchasing people. Now, when I first read this and heard this in the context of what I've said to this point in time, I got to admit my initial reaction was to be somewhat offended by it because, it's, dime a dozen disposable cogs come into mind. But then I started to think about that first part. One strategic business thinker. And that's what we're talking about today. What does that mean? What is a strategic business thinker? And again, I'd ask you this question if I were there. When you think of the term strategic, what does that mean to you? What does that mean to your particular organization as well? Those are keys because that is the chasm between where we were and where we're going. And unless you're able to bridge that and identify what that involves, you're going to run into problems in maintaining relevancy. Now, the next slide that's coming up and prompting is this, and this is the Aberdeen survey to which I referred. And even though it's from 2007, it's still much the same today because it hasn't progressed, or let's just say the profession itself hasn't progressed as fast or as quickly as it should. But look at these statistics. Less than 20%, and I alluded to this earlier, of CPOs feel, or finance CFOs feel that CPOs and their staffs had any positive impact to competitiveness. That means more than 80% of chief financial officers do not consider the strategic advantage of purchasing. Now, whose fault is that? Where does that disconnect occur? On average, only 46% feel that procurement has contributed to enterprise growth, and 57% feels that it's contributed to enterprise profitability. And I'm looking at this now, and I'm thinking to myself, this is a major disconnect. Are these numbers still relevant? Are they better? Are they worse? Especially when you consider the advent of globalized marketplaces, of multiple supply chains, and the complexity of purchasing more so today than it's ever been. We're not dealing with what you call geographically confined boundaries anymore, or the larger enterprises are the ones dealing on a global basis. And you have to deal effectively, obviously, as the supply base begins to grow. But if I look at this, and that's CFO speak, if they don't believe that I'm making a contribution, if they don't believe that we're adding value to the bottom line and competitive advantage, well, how much of an ear are we going to get, and how much longer will our relevancy be maintained? And that's really the key point here. Going back to that earlier slide, is if you think about it, where do we fit in? How are we relevant? What is strategic thinking? From a CIO standpoint, and I'm going to mention this as we go to the next slide, is the three players in this what you call dance, if you will, is CPO, the purchasing department, CFO, the finance department, and CIO, the tech department or the IT department. These all come together. Now, in the information week, CIOs are recognizing the fact that they're not well-rounded. That, again, they can't work in isolation. So they themselves, and even the CFOs, are dealing and grappling to varying degrees with the same problems that purchasing people are. The disconnect is that they haven't converged to a point of what you can call a consistent understanding or mandate, where, again, you don't have these artificially created functional silos. I mean, I hope this makes sense to everybody at this point in time. And if there is a question, certainly you can raise your hand. I'm sure Rich will be happy to run out there, or someone from his team, and you can ask that. But at the end of the day, the words are this: in times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped in a world that no longer exists. Ask yourself this, and this is the whole point of what we're going to touch on today and understand today. And I want to emphasize this again: where CFOs are coming from, where CIOs are coming from, and where purchasing professionals have to come from. Are you still relevant with the knowledge you have? Is it still relevant in today's changing world? And that's a hard question that you have to ask yourself. But these are again, not just the suppositions and what we're going to find as we move forward of one individual, myself, because, each of us have a certain degree of experience, but no one has all the answers. So what I tend to rely on is, again, what the industry is saying, what the statistics are saying, what the feedback is coming in. And when we look at it, let's start by understanding, before we look at ourselves, what the CFOs are facing, what they consider to be important, and then afterwards, how does this align with what purchasing wants to accomplish? I mean, how many of you out there, and I don't know if I can see hands, you may not want to put them up, but please do, how many of you have often considered the fact that CFOs are going through a major change, a major paradigm shift in what they do, and understand what that shift entails. Is anybody out there understands that? I'm sort of looking down. I can see you from behind, so I can't see you from forward. But CFOs have changed how they think and how they do business. To start, they're talking about the fact that in their career there's been an absence of passion. They haven't been willing to take on challenges outside of their defined duties. They're talking about having increased ethics in terms of business dealing and the socially responsible enterprise. They're looking at a more strategic view of running the organization, which is one of the reasons why we're seeing this sort of migration, if you will, of finance people moving into the purchasing world. They experience at multiple levels within an organization. In other words, they're no longer dealing with just what's involved in finance, but peeling back the onion, if you will, and trying to understand the intricacies of how it works, the enterprise works at different levels, and the impact that that has on balance sheets, on PE ratios, and all these critical elements that we should all know. Focuses on actions and results to build the organization, which includes a marketing element to it. So that's part of the key equation in there. Now, on the other side of the coin, knowing this about CFOs, knowing this about finance officers, what does it tell you? What do you gather from this? Does any of this surprise you? Does any of this challenge you? How many of you have actually gone into the office and sat down with your CFO or somebody in the finance department, bearing in mind the statistics are that 80% do not feel that purchasing adds a competitive advantage. And by the way, I did stop to ask, maybe you agree with that. I don't, but maybe you agree with that. But you have people who do not think you add value. How many of you have sat down with your finance people to understand what they're going through? And what does it tell you about what they're going through? And as we progress, knowing this, what do you do? What can you do as a purchasing professional? What do you need to do to better connect with your finance? And that's really the key part of this. Which attributes, and go on to the next slide there, gentlemen, which attributes or areas of focus does a CFO have? And what's the grounds of commonality? What builds that particular bridge of understanding and builds that chain link of communication and collaboration, which is so essential, but by and large has been missing? So that's what you look at from a CFO standpoint. When you go to a CIO, and this is an interesting perspective, what's important to the CIO? What is the Chief Information Officer looking at? Well, they need to be more innovative. Believe it or not, many IT departments and senior executives feel that they are far behind where the industry is going. Technology that enables me to come and stand before you, virtually speaking today, is something that has been elusive to many of them. It's almost like, and I don't want to date myself, it's almost like going from the mainframe to the PC, where many in the IT department said the PC was a passing fad and that it would disappear within a matter of a year or two. Well, we know what happened there. They don't want to repeat that mistake. What's that old saying? If you fail to learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. So they recognize the fact that innovation is a key. There, of course, are major challenges they're having. Again, the survey of all CEOs, they actually are looking at changing the title of what they are from Chief Information Officer to Chief Engagement Officer. And certainly, you know, it's kind of interesting because they are now looking outside of the framework of the technology and looking for that practical connection. Now, I want to just say, part of that problem is that when it comes to the implementation of ERP-based solutions, when it comes to the implementation even of some of the software as a service solutions, but certainly the advent of software as a service, and we'll touch on that briefly, what's interesting is that 85% of all those initiatives have failed to deliver the results, and sometimes with dire consequences. In fact, one of the most famous cases, I mean, in the UK, Cadbury Schweppes is one example of a failed initiative that hit the headlines, but Hewlett-Packard, who were championing themselves as a system integrator, as an implementer, if you will, of ERP solution, actually failed to successfully install their SAP solution for their supply chain, which isn't exactly a raving endorsement. Well, things like that literally stop you in your tracks. And so many of the organizations, in terms of innovation, are looking at how they redefine their role, how transformations can occur, and how can they get out there and talk with people. Now, from the purchasing perspective, I have to pause and say, what are we doing to engage, the chief information officer? What are we doing to engage the other departments that we service? Because as purchasing and supply chain and logistics has become incredibly important and strategic to organizations, and it's now recognized, are we communicating and understanding how what we do as a profession serves the greater enterprise as a whole? Now, poor existing resource utilization is another concern they have, looking beyond technology, and we talked about this. Rationalization of existing platforms, and again, next generation communication, much like we're talking about here today. These are some of the important points. Now, as we move to the next slide, SaaS, or software as a service, is becoming a major player. Traditionally, these applications were seen as bolt-on applications or solutions to a larger ERP platform. In other words, they didn't view it as being a standalone. Now, just to clarify, software as a service is not a pricing model that's defined as a transactional-based pay-as-you-go type of scenario. Software as a service is actually a significant shift that was actually predicted back in 2001 by the Industry Association for Software Companies. They did a study funded by the large ERP vendors, and they said that on-demand applications will become a reality, and eventually the licensing and the monthly maintenance platforms and the technology built around that will again dissolve into something completely different. And some of you may be surprised by this, but last fall, many analysts predicted that SAP may actually not be in business a year or two from now, which is kind of shocking. And I can refer you to that particular story and links in terms of that, but what they're talking about is that there is such a major shift now that mainstream has recognized that pay-as-you-go and software as a service technology has advanced. And again, the globalization and the capability that that provides, leveraging the internet, is a phenomenal development. Well, these are major changes that are really shaking up the chief information officer. Now, when you look at, from your perspective, and if you could go to the next slide, when you look at it from your perspective, what does this tell you about the CIO? You know, when you're out there and you want a solution to help you to do your job better, to engage a larger number of suppliers, to automate the process and reduce cycle time, traditionally when you go to the IT department, you'd be put on a long list of things, usually at the bottom, and they'd get around to you in a few months. Well, looking at what they're dealing with now, looking at what you need to accomplish, how do you best position automating your function to make your job easier and more efficient? These are the hot points that with chief information officers are going to peak and get their attention. What are you doing in terms of understanding that so that you can effectively engage them? Then, of course, the next slide is, again, what are the benefits to you of doing this? So if you look at the first little bit in terms of CFOs and CIOs, these are through industry surveys, profession surveys, within the respective Chief Information Officers Group and the Chief Financial Officers Group. These are surveys that they're actually responding back based upon the demands of executive. I don't know if any of this surprises you, but these are the key points and the hot points for being engaged. And as you go to the next slide, ask yourself this, and this is the commonality. This is where collaboration begins, or at least the origins of collaboration begin. Ask yourself this. What challenges are they facing, and how does it align with some of the challenges that I'm facing in the purchasing department? And how do they, for lack of a better word, how do they complement each other? How can we fit those puzzle pieces? Remember earlier on we talked about this, the big puzzle where you fit in. How do we find complementary needs that we can collaborate on to work together? And then when you introduce the chief financial officer's objectives, how do we meet those needs in there? That's how you begin to put together, for lack of a better term, a mosaic of a holistic view of how an enterprise runs today, especially in a global marketplace where functional execution is not the way to go any further. I mean, it's funny, and again, to digress a little bit, I did an interview with Bill Michaels, who wrote a book on supply chain. He's well known, and he talked about what happened at Toyota with that massive problem with the accelerator. And one of the things that was interesting is technically they did everything right, because what they did from a buying perspective is they said, why don't we buy volume and try to find ways where we can have common parts across our entire line of cars, different models, different makes. It seems logical in that one-dimensional view. However, the tragedy there is that when there's a failure in one, Unlike before where you had unique requirements for different lines of automobiles, they didn't govern or plan for that to happen, obviously. All of a sudden, the entire line gets thrust into question. And the quality and the reliability leads, obviously, to a congressional hearing. But, you see, that's one area where it makes sense from a volume purchasing standpoint and a logistical standpoint to standardize across the board. Yet on the other side, if you don't have the proper strategies in place to address problems that do happen, and they do, now you've got a catastrophic situation. So that's really the key in terms of coming together and why collaboration, why these functional silos are coming down. Now, again, if there's any questions, Rich, if you're there with the mic, run around. I know we have about 7 minutes to go, so I'll try to talk as fast as I could or can. But, I mean, these are the key points. If you take away anything from this morning session, believe me, I could talk to you for hours. I don't know if you could listen, but I love this stuff. If you can take away anything, is how do I better, or hopefully has this helped me better understand what's happening within my own enterprise from the standpoint of the finance and the IT department. Now, as we go to the next one, internet and social media, because, I mean, that's really a hot part of how companies do business, especially with the emergence of SaaS. And as we go to the next slide, what's interesting is the internet is one of those things, and social networks and social media are one of those things that touch on and run through all areas of the company, whether it be sales and marketing or as the example given here in terms of our own professional development. You know, a few years ago, about 2 years ago actually, I assembled a panel of experts that included IACCM and other organizations coming together and asked the question, is the traditional purchasing association model dead? Now, what's interesting about that is that one of the biggest complaints, and this was one of them here, one of the biggest complaints that organizations had is that most of the curriculums have not kept pace with the changes we've just covered in terms of the realities of the industry. Many of them have started to just, or continued at that point in time, to fall on the curriculums of familiarity. And going back to that Harvard Business Review article, certainly that reflects a catastrophic issue or potential in that you're left out of the loop. And one of the reasons why CPO agenda executives felt that the best people to run a purchasing department isn't somebody who comes from purchasing. So when you look at the emergence of the internet in our profession, the tools that are now available, the social communities that are emerging for organizations and being launched individually, the changing curriculums where, you know, you have, and I alluded to earlier, the 5 or rather 6-part series I just wrote called Bridging the Disconnect Between Finance and Purchasing, where I referred to Robert Rutsky. And I don't know if you've heard of Rutsky before, but if you haven't, check it out. He's with Graybeard Advisors. He wrote a book called Straight to the Bottom Line, where he talked about PE ratios, where he talked about other factors that are important, ROIC, that help to communicate better and understand how purchasing can drive the bottom line of an organization. Well, now what's happening through the internet is the convenience and the accessibility to information is key. And what associations are becoming now is the funnel, if you will, or the filter to be able to access that large sea of information. Because let's face it, we don't have a lot of hours in the day. So you want to be able to look at how do I leverage the internet to understand all of these things and how I fit in and to really progress relative to the curriculum that's being offered. One of the things I will say is any association with whom you deal or belong, what are they doing in terms of providing you with this Web 2.0 accessibility? Because that's where the market is going. That's where the market is looking to the expertise in purchasing. Now, as we go to the next slide, and we talked about this, communities of interest. You know, in LinkedIn, many people belong to different groups. There's one group called Purchasing Professionals that has something like 60,000, 70,000 members, which is a testimony into the effectiveness and the importance of social media and social networking. You know, where are those groups? Do you belong to LinkedIn? Do you belong on the different Facebook models that are being offered by organizations like IACCM and others? What interactive tools are available? All of these things are available, and you have to avail yourself of that because that's where the most current and breaking information will occur. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the question is how are you, and this is a question you have to ask yourself, how are you leveraging the internet now? Are you? Are you making it work for you? And if, you know, and again, you can do a show of hands if you like, but how many of you feel or believe you're leveraging the resource of the internet to be able to do the job that you want to do and tap into the reservoir, if you will, of information, in-depth understanding of what's there and the changes that I've talked about? That's an important question that you have to ask yourself, along with understanding, or do I understand what chief information officers and chief financial officers are facing? And if you can answer those questions, you'll begin to start to position yourself and your ongoing relevancy to your enterprise. So that's really where we'll leave it now. I mean, there's much more that we can cover, but I see I'm running probably at the last couple of minutes. Are there any questions from the audience with what you heard? Do you agree with what I've said? Are you saying, gee, virtually the guy's out there in left field, I don't agree with it? Have any of you contemplated that? Why don't I turn it over to you then and give me some ideas in terms of your thoughts on what you've seen? Or is this the post-lunch, I'm going to have a nap? Do you agree with what I've said? How many of you did, let's put it this way, how many of you would disagree with what I've said this morning or this afternoon where you are? Do we see any hands out there? And why? There's the important thing. I love disagreement. Just have a reason why.
I think someone's got to say something. I'm approaching it from an accounting professional, so the other side and the CFO side. And I think a lot of large organisations did actually engage with procurement probably in the late 90s, early 21st century, in basically around quality chains, etc., and involving procurement in the design of products. So I'm not sure the disconnect with the professional procurement team's always been there from the finance point of view.
Well, that's an interesting observation. Not one that I hear often, but very interesting observation. Let me say this in 2 points. Before pointing the Aberdeen study, because that was a survey conducted by CFOs, and you saw the results from that, so I'll ask you if that surprises you. But the second thing that's interesting is in that roundtable, CPO Agenda roundtable, they had the chief purchasing officer who left one company and joined Nestle. And he said, it's like night and day. The company that I was with before used to engage us at the very beginning, especially on large capital expenditures. Now at Nestle's, I'm no longer engaged. I'm just given marching orders as to what I have to do because someone else has decided this. So let me ask you, do you think that is what you just observed, is that something that is unique to certain companies who are in tune with the importance of that communication? And do you think that that's changing based upon what the example I've just given, plus the Aberdeen study? I mean, you can't argue with not what you can, but, Aberdeen is a reputable firm. Why do you think that more organizations don't feel what you feel, or what your experience has certainly shown to be?
I basically think it's down to personalities, and what you mentioned earlier, the strategic business thinker within there, and I think maybe certain of the larger corporations have the HR department has actually been recruiting people who can think outside of their compartment, and yes, I imagine that certain more conservative industries are behind on that and not engaging procurement. So I think it's the forward leading industries, and probably the technology section is ahead of the rest of the game on there. But,
okay, now I have to ask you this one question, and I alluded to this earlier, because when I speak all over, I find increasing number of finance people attending purchasing conferences or getting their accreditation in purchasing. What brought you here today? Because you're finance.
Well, I'm finance, but I've moved into a career in consulting, and largely around procurement consulting. Yes, partly it is seeing the credit crunch and moving into a market, but also my interest in systems. And procurement seems to be an area where systems are really moving and motoring along at a speed at the moment. It's a very interesting sector.
You're right on that. It is fascinating. Well, I think you have some good observation, but I think the point that you said, and it's very well stated, is that the silos and the lack of communication were more dealing with the personality and the viewpoint. And is it safe to say now that that's starting to shift, at least on a larger basis, or do we still have a long ways to go?
This is getting a bit of a two-way conversation.
I love that. That's the best way.
I think maybe a couple of years to go, but it's, I mean, events like this really spread the word, and the more procurement professionals that are coming to events like this, and the more that SIPS in the UK is promoting this, the better, because I think the expertise is building.
Great. Well, listen, thank you for your contribution. Any other questions or comments? And again, you don't have to agree with me, but yet we will definitely have a two-way conversation.
John, hi, it's Claire again. Thanks very much for joining us, and all went really well. The experiment worked. Nice to speak to you again.
Well, hopefully my large bearded head wasn't too imposing on the big screen.
Oh, of course not.
Flaws in turning 50 not that long ago. Thanks so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Just to let you know the next sessions, Chartered Institute